offline everyday speech. So I want to start by considering a classic saying. We often say that talk is cheap. And what we mean by this is that there's virtually no cost attached in proffering some words. So in terms of energy that they are involved in making noise, in communicating an utterance. So there's clearly a sense in which this saying is correct, but do we have some technical? Very small. Okay, fantastic. So on the other hand, like philosophers have been talking about communication for a long time, and they've started to point out that actually there are some costs involved in some important way to in communicating stuff. And in particular, when we communicate, we acquire obligation. For instance, I might make a promise, and that puts me under obligation to perform what I promised. And in general, it seems that there are sort of normative consequences, social consequences to speech that make speech not so cheap after all. One way to put it in sort of speech act theoretic term, for those who are familiar with it, is to say that locution is cheap. So the act of producing the noise or writing down is cheap, but illocution, the kind of conventional or social consequences of speaking, are such that there are actually costs attached to communicating something. So I want to study these costs, and the topic of this talk is how like this sort of different costs, differential costs between online and offline speech. So just a little bit of a sort of slightly longer parenthesis on what kind of costs are involved in communication. First of all, there's the issue of your epistemic reputation. So like philosophers sometimes talk about testimony, this idea that we can learn from other people's words and what they say. And obviously, whether our decision to trust or not to trust a person is often based on their past performance. So whether they're truthful in the past or not, if I decide not to be truthful, there are some costs attached to this strategy in the sense that I damage my reputation and you might not trust me in a future interaction. And, this is a sort of epistemic dimension of communicating falsehoods, but obviously there are also social costs that are broader than epistemic costs. And by this, I mean that you can damage your friendships, the sort of social bonds that you have with other people, your social standing in different groups, your influence in decision-making. People might decide not to go along with your proposals if you're often deceptive, and so on and so forth. So this is a similar dimension of costs to the first one, but it's slightly different in that it has a slightly less epistemic accent. And obviously, in communicating falsehoods and breaking communicative norms, you might also expose yourself to criticism, to blame, which also might be something that you want to avoid. So sort of cost involved. Here I'm just summarizing, like this sort of philosophical literature that has covered the sort of costs that are attached with communicating falsehoods in particular and with breaking communicative norms more generally. And the broader idea is that it is this cost, it is social cost that motivate us to be reliable in communicating, to be truthful in communicating. So it's not just about being a selfless person, a good person. There's also sort of selfish motivation to be truthful, which is that we don't want to incur this cost. So a rational but Machiavellian speaker also has good motivations to be truthful, which are the ones that we just reviewed. This picture is complicated by strategic deniability, and I want to say something about that before we move on to online speech. And this is sort of underexplored topic insofar, but it's coming to the fore lately. So the idea here is that when you communicate indirectly, so when you say something like implicitly as opposed to explicitly, you're afforded some plausible deniability, which means that you can coherently deny that you meant to communicate what you actually communicated. So here we have two nice examples from Steven Pinker. One is a veiled threat. Nice house you got there. Would be a real shame if something happened to it. And the other one is a subtle bribe. Gee, officer, I was wondering whether there might be some way we could take care of the ticket here. So in both cases, I can coherently deny that I meant to communicate what I actually obviously meant to communicate. So in the first case, I might say, oh, I wasn't, suggesting that I will burn down your house if you don't do this. I was just saying it would be a real shame if something bad happened. There was nothing implied beyond what I literally said there. Similarly for the bribe, I could say, look, officer, I just wanted to pay the fine in full right now. I thought, it would be easier if we did this way. So the idea here is that when you have plausible deniability, you can mitigate the risks associated with violating a communicative norm by being able to sort of retract the implicature if later on you're sort of caught. So the idea here, you can get away with communicating something by being able to retract it at a later stage if people, in the case of the bribe, for instance, it could be the situation in which the policeman does not want the bribe, is a honest policeman, but you don't know it until the time he reacts. So the idea is that you sort of leave two options open, and later on you adjust your conduct accordingly. Similarly with deception, it's a matter of whether you're caught. If you're caught deceiving, you might say, oh, look, I wasn't trying to imply the false proposition. I was just literally saying what I said. So here, my examples were sort of complex constructions, but we also have sort of inbuilt linguistic devices that we have in everyday language, pretty simple one, that allow us to mitigate the costs associated with communicating something by using hedge speech, by using mitigation. So here you have evidential, examples of evidential. So you can say something like, according to a certain source, and then the proposition follows. Then I can retract the implicature that the proposition is true. I might say, oh, look, I wasn't suggesting, for instance, here in the example, the conferences in Macau. I was just saying that CNN has reported that. This has nothing to do with me. Similarly, with epistemic models, I was just saying that it was probably true. I was speech reports, I was just reporting what he said. I wasn't suggesting it's true. Or ambiguity, you might imagine that there's another city, Macau in California. It's not the case, but if it was the case, I could say, oh, I didn't mean Macau. I meant Macau in California. So the idea here is that anytime we have an utterance that admits to interpretation, you have plausible deniability insofar as you can jump from one interpretation to the other, depending on what suits you. And you can use, obviously, that for deceptive purposes. If people catch you in the attempt at deceiving, you might always insist that you meant the truthful proposition. Interestingly, this kind of strategy is used by politicians often. Trump in particular has made these expressions part of his sort of vocabulary, the Trumpese, so to say. And for instance, the expression you have here in the slide, a lot of people are saying, has often been used by Donald Trump to spread all sort of conspiracy theories without taking responsibility for the content that follow, because you can always say, oh, look, I wasn't saying it myself. I'm just saying that these people are saying it. I have nothing to do with this. But obviously, you still pass the message along. And that's precisely the dynamics of plausible deniability. You pass on the message while not taking responsibility for the message, while not paying the costs that are associated with it. Now we're moving on to online speech. And this is kind of what got me into studies on reposting. There have been several cases in which Donald Trump in particular, but also other politicians, have used reposts to spread a certain message while not taking responsibility for the content of that message. So Trump, for instance, has been caught reposting racist stuff, reposting false crime statistics, claiming that black people kill a lot more white people, more people than white in America, or whatever, like all sorts of outrageous stuff. And then when it was proven that what he reposted was false, or when it was pointed out that it was racist or in other ways offensive, Trump would always be like, oh, what do you mean? I'm just I'm just passing along the message. I just wanted to invite a discussion. I wasn't suggesting at all that this was true, or, if what was challenged was the truthfulness of the content. Trump would say stuff like, look, I can't check every source. I'm just reporting what the source said. So the idea here is that reposting is behaving in a similar way to those other expressions that we have seen earlier, in particular, reporting that a source has said something. And this can be a convenient way to spread misinformation or like all sort of inflammatory content or offensive content without taking responsibility for it. So there's existing philosophical discussion on this phenomenon insofar as philosophers have been interested in studying what reposting means and trying to give a sort of account of its illocutionary contribution to the conversation, what kind of force it comes with. There's often this saying that a retweet is not an endorsement that you find in some profiles online. And there is disagreement in the literature about what reposting actually is. But we tend to agree that it's not quite the same as making another assertion. So if I repost a certain content, it's not like I'm saying it myself. It's not as strong, but what is it exactly? So some theories are around. Some suggest that it's something like pointing or directing the attention to a content. I've suggested that it's something like that, but it also has elements of quotation. So it's similar to when you quote someone. Frigerio and Tenchini have suggested that it's like distributing a document around people. There are various accounts around. There's no need to go into the details here, but I would say that independently of which account we pick here, they kind of converge on agreeing that it's not quite the same as reasserting and agreeing that reposting affords the speaker some plausible deniability. So in this sense, it would be similar to the kind of expressions that we have seen earlier. So here we're getting close to the empirical study. I will start presenting our results in a minute, but basically I wanted first to present the general idea that comes behind the study. So we know from empirical research that reposts play an important role in spreading misinformation, a kind of important vehicle or conduct for this fake news, in that they help their spread, right? And we also know that reposting has reduced costs in two important senses. It has reduced locutionary costs, even compared to normal speech, insofar as, like if I have to tell you the story, if I have, I don't know, to tell you about a conspiracy theory, QAnon conspiracy theory, say, it would take quite some time to sort of tell you about how these Democrats, they hide their children in the basement and they do all sort of crazy stuff with it. So there is some practical costs in terms of time that it would take to tell you this. There are some cognitive costs insofar as I have to think about how to tell you the story. But when I repost something, I just have to click twice on a link and there you go. I have shared it. I have spread it, the same conspiracy theory, but with much less practical effort. And on top of that, there are these reduced reputational costs, similar to the ones that we explored in indirect speech. So the idea here that since I am afforded some degree of plausible deniability, if it turns out that what I reposted was false, I would sort of pay a lower reputational cost than if I communicated it explicitly. That's the hypothesis, at least. On top of this, we know that reposting is increasingly prevalent in social media environments. So these figures are actually going up every time I do the presentation. The latest figure I found was that 49% of the content shared on X is shared by reposting. So what this means is that we have a sort of asymmetry with offline speech, because when we chat in everyday context, it's not like half of what we say is reporting what other people are saying. We kind of take responsibility on our own for pretty much every one of the sentences that we utter, with a few exceptions. In online spaces, this kind of thing is flipped, and reposting is almost the standard. It's half and half. So this is very interesting because deniable speech becomes much more prevalent in this environment. So the hypothesis here is that we have a sort of deadly combination of prevalence of deniability and lower reputational risks associated with deniability that makes it makes the prevalence of repost in online spaces a sort of ideal conduit for misinformation and therefore like sort of worrying phenomenon. So obviously here we made some assumptions about the nature of reposting and in particular the fact that it comes with lower reputational costs that they've been supported by some theoretical consideration, but not really by any like factual study. So we were interested here in testing in particular whether this assumption, this assumption has any sort of basis. So is it actually true that reposts have lower costs, lower reputational risk and reputational costs? This was the sort of underlying question that motivated our empirical study. So I conducted this study with Marcus Nier that now works at the University of Graz. And yeah, so the first study that we conducted is a study in which we compare the sort of expressions in offline speech that afford us some plausible deniability and repost. So the idea here is that deniable speech in general, so like hedged or mitigated assertions, come with lower reputational costs. So we should see that false reported claim should damage one's reputation less than direct claim. That's something that I assumed in the beginning when I was talking about offline speech in general, but again, we haven't tested it. So we started by testing that. That's our first hypothesis. And then obviously I was saying, well, reposting seems to similarly afford plausible deniability. So it should also similarly come with reduced reputational costs compared to directly posting. That gives us two hypotheses, right? The first hypothesis is that the costs are reduced, and the other hypothesis is that they are reduced in a similar way. So it should sort of pattern with mitigated offline speech. As a sort of side quest in our first study, we also wanted to see how people sort of conceptualize reposts. So do they think that it's something like stating, or do they think that it's something like implying or merely reporting? We wanted to have a look at how they perceive reposts. So the kind of structure of this study and the other study is the following. We recruited people on Prolific. We pre-screened them to make sure they speak English, they know about social media. We used about 150 participants per condition. In this case, it was 305 overall. And then we would first present them with a sort of trick question and attention check to make sure they're actually reading. Then we would send them to read the vignette, ask them some test questions, some control question. We would get rid of every participant that failed the attention check or failed the control question to sort of clean the data, and then ask some demographic, etc. Here we just had two conditions, one in which there is a report on a blog and the other a repost online. So the basic story is that we have a popular blog covering local news in Barcelona that says that a restaurant is shutting down. And then later that day, another popular blog makes a similar story and it reports what the first blog says. So instead of making a statement, it has the same statement, but qualified so that it says that according to the other blog, that's what's happening. So this would be a case in which we have a mere report as opposed to an assertion. First speaker makes an assertion, second speaker just report the first assertion. And then we have the same story, but on Facebook. And first we have a post and then a repost by a page with the same name. Then we ask people to just make sure that they understood the question, and we ask two main test questions to decide how to measure reputational costs. First of all, we measure willingness to donate, and second, we were I can't read there. I can go like this. There you go. So which source you think is less reliable when it comes to this particular topic, namely information about restaurants in Barcelona. And then the question about how they conceptualize, how they think about this statement. Oh, sorry. Yes, which was Barsi News claimed. Barsi News was the blog that reposted or reported, and we wanted to see if people were classifying this as a claim or not. So we were asking them to agree or disagree. So our results were consistent with our hypothesis. So basically we saw that the original poster who communicated something false was deemed less reliable than the reposter. In both the Facebook condition and in the blog condition, so the one in which there was just a speech report as opposed to a repost. Similarly and consistently, we see that willingness to donate follows similar patterns, so that people are more happy to donate to the reposter than the poster, which also signifies that the sort of reputation has been affected. The reputation of the reposter is affected less than the original poster. And we found no difference in the pattern that these two media follow. So we also confirmed the hypothesis that we should see a similar behavior in speech report and in repost on social media. So basically, reposting behaves a little bit like those expressions, those hedge assertion that we reviewed in the beginning of the talk. So moving on to the explorative question, whether people think that we should classify these utterances as claims. We saw that both in the Facebook scenario and in the blog scenario, participants were more willing to agree that the reposter made a claim. So the idea here is that our first evidence at least suggests that people are classifying this as a claim, although you can see that there's a bit of uncertainty, especially in the Facebook scenario. So it's like they're more likely to agree for sure, but it's not like everybody agrees. There's a solid 40% that disagrees. So second experiment, basically, when we first presented this study, a lot of people objected that the sort of sources were companies, blogs, Facebook pages rather than individuals. So they said, what about individuals? We were also curious about this. And obviously, we were also interested in testing other platforms. So this is a bit of a test for robustness. Do these patterns survive when you switch around a few things, where you move from groups to individual users, when you move from Facebook to Twitter? So here we had two conditions, Facebook and Twitter, and we had an individual poster, but pretty much is the same experiment without the blog vignette, so that now we are only doing social media. Here we have the posting condition and the reposting condition as well. And you can see that we get exactly the same result, with the original poster being deemed less reliable and people preferring to donate to the reposter rather than the poster. An interesting fact now is that we changed a little bit the follow-up question, because we thought, oh, maybe the question was a bit confusing when you get, people were split, if you remember, when they were meant to classify it as a claim or not. So we gave them a different option. We said, what if we specified a little bit more what the two options are? Because we were asking to agree or disagree with the claim, but what is the other option? So this time we gave them two options. They could say that the speaker stated something or that they merely reported something. And here we find that, the effect is completely reverted. So now people are not only agreeing that it's just a report, but they are strongly agreeing, so that we no longer have the sort of split audience that is quite unsure whether or not it's a claim or not. Everybody agrees, almost everybody agrees, that the repost is merely a report, which again suggests that participants classify the act of reposting stuff online, the act of resharing, as something that comes closer to one of those hedged assertions rather than an explicit act of reasserting or an endorsement. Okay, so a third example, which is going a third sort of experiment, which is going to add a bit more nuance to the picture I've presented so far. So you know that, I think, anybody familiar with speech act theory? Something I mentioned earlier. Speech acts, according to many philosophers, are governed by norms. I think this is uncontroversial. We think that people shouldn't lie, etc. But there is disagreement about which norms exactly govern speech. So what are we supposed to communicate, especially when it comes to the dimension of truthfulness? We were interested in seeing whether or not there is a difference between the norms that govern truthfulness offline and online. And in particular, we have existing empirical literature trying to explore precisely what happens offline. So what are the expectations of truthfulness that govern speech offline? And the standard approach, like basically philosophers like Williamson suggest that there is just one property that makes an assertion epistemically appropriate. Williamson says it's knowledge, so that you're only permitted to make an assertion when you know its content. Some other people say, no, it's truth, it's not knowledge. Some other people say, no, it's justification. It's nothing like truth or knowledge, because you don't have to state only the facts. You can be permissibly asserting even if you communicate a falsehood. So there's a bit of philosophical debate in this respect. And we were interested in intervening in that debate by looking at how offline communication compares to online communication. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of where the empirical literature is going with assertion, we know that from previous study that basically justification, so not truth or knowledge, is what motivates people to classify an assertion as permissible. So this is a study by Marcus Neri. You can see that with knowledge, people say that the utterance is assertable, it's true, and it's known. In this other condition, true justified belief, we have the same, but people disagree that it's known. So it's regarded as assertable, but not known, which falsifies the Williamsonian hypothesis that knowledge is needed for assertability. And people still agree mostly that false justified belief are sufficient to make a permissible assertion, but obviously it's not deemed true and it's not deemed known. So this is just one of the studies, but there is converging evidence from several studies that suggest that justification is basically the norm of assertion, if at least we want to rely on empirical research to settle the question. So there's a sort of, in the literature on reposting, several authors have pointed out that the situation might be a bit more complicated when it comes to the norms of reposting, because we're still negotiating what they are, right? It's a sort of new form of communication. It's not been around for long. So it makes sense to think that we haven't quite agreed on what the exact expectations are. There's some leeway for negotiation of these norms. So some authors like Rini have stressed the importance of this point, and we were interested in, well, if we're still negotiating them, what are they? What do people think right now? And maybe something similar is true of posting as well. So making it so like tweeting something or posting on Facebook. On the one hand, we might think, well, it's just the online counterpart of asserting. Just like asserting on the phone is not a new speech act, why would asserting on Twitter be a different speech act? That's a good point. On the other hand, there are important differences. You're broadcasting to a large audience that can only interact in certain ways. So you might think that some of these differences are structural enough to sort of trigger a normative difference. So we wanted to just test whether there's a difference between an assertion offline, a post, so a tweet, and a repost or a retweet, whether there are differences in the norm governing the speech. So we created 4 conditions, 4 vignettes, manipulating whether the content was justified and whether it was true. So we have a justified true belief, justified false belief, unjustified true belief, and unjustified false belief. And then you multiply these 4 for our 3 ways of communicating something. So a dialogue, offline, a tweet, and a retweet. And this is what, okay, this is the structure of the experiment, but this is what we found. So as you might see, the first impression is like pretty much the same for every way of communicating, which is pretty surprising actually. You can see there are some small differences, but you should look at the error bars here. They're not really significant, the differences. You should also know that this is a pilot study, so it's a small sample size, and you should take everything with a pinch of salt. And the kind of interesting result is here. When it comes to unjustified true beliefs, you can see that retweeting something is sort of subject to a more lenient standard for permissibility, such that people are basically saying, look, if you get things wrong, if you get things right, even if you had no evidence in support of your claim, that's not good if you're tweeting. That's not good if you are making an assertion offline. But if you're posting something, the fact that you randomly got things right, even if it was outside your control, kind of makes up for the fact that you had no evidence in its support, so that retweeting under those conditions is appropriate. So basically, we found a difference also here, which is sort of coherent with our story, because our story is that retweeting should be subject to more lenient normative standard. But on the other hand, it's kind of odd because we only see this pattern arising under one of these conditions. So it's not really clear what could motivate this audit. If you have any ideas, maybe there will be time in the Q&A. So I just want to close with the last study. I'll try to go as fast as possible to leave time for discussion. But basically, again, also this study is going to add a little bit of nuance to the picture delineated so far, because basically, I stress so far what communicators have to gain from reposting something, namely that they are paying lower reputational costs if the proposition turns out to be false. But we might think that if the proposition turns out to be true, you might also fail to cash in reputational point, or at least you will cash in less reputational point than compared to saying something yourself. So the idea here is that if you stick your neck out, you have more to lose, because obviously, if it turns out that what you're communicating is false, it's your content, it's what you communicated that turned out to be false. But if it turns out to be true, then sticking your neck out might actually be a good thing, because then you're taking responsibility for the good thing of getting things right. So this shows that there's a potential trade-off in choosing reposting over posting that makes it not necessarily, the best strategy under all conditions. If you are being truthful, maybe posting rather than reposting is the best way to cash in reputation. So once again, this is a hypothesis. It is coherent with some empirical research in this field, but again, it hasn't been tested. So the way we went for testing this is, again, a very simple design. We showed people a vignette, which came in two versions. One was a version in which the proposition turns out to be true, and one is a version in which the proposition turns out to be false. So this is the false version. Again, it's about restaurant in Barcelona, so that we can easily compare with previous results. And we also tell people that there are some consequences attached to the falsehood of the proposition. So the restaurant ends up losing some customers because these blogs have communicated that it was shutting down. And then in the true condition, there is a consequence as well, because this prevents people from going to the restaurant when it's actually closed, so they would have lost time for nothing. So here are the results, and once again, they're pretty much coherent with our story. So the distribution, you can see here when we ask which communicator is more reliable under the true condition, then people are all agreeing that it's a poster that is more reliable. And when we ask who is less reliable in the false condition, then it's the poster again, but we have changed the question. So we have basically confirmed the hypothesis that reputation is affected with sort of opposite patterns, such that when you communicate something false, you lose more reputational point, and when you communicate something true, you gain more reputational point. Here is the more, and here is the less, right? And the same we can see with donation, when the willingness to donate goes all to the poster under true information and goes all to the reposter under false information, when they obviously both communicated the same false content or the same true content. Okay, so we found symmetrical opposite effect. They are coherent with the story that we told so far. And yes, the picture is a little bit more complicated than it was in the beginning, because it's not like reposting, you know, it's this sort of strategy that pays off under any circumstances. Actually, to repost might not be convenient if you are communicating something true. So it's like posting is a high risk, high reward games, whereas reposting is a low risk, low reward game, so to say. Okay, so I'm coming to a close here. If you remember in the beginning, we were trying to determine whether reposting really is cheap, in the sense in which talk is cheap. And yeah, that was linked to the idea that in deniable speech, we can communicate false messages at lower reputational costs. And you have a little bit of a breakdown of the results of each experiment. But I won't reread them. I want to leave more space for the Q&A, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay. Wasn't sure who put their hands up first, so maybe we'll go with Emma. No. We'll take this.
Thank you. It's on now. Thank you. That was a great talk. On the point you had, the one you kind of skipped over quickly towards the end on reposting unjustified true beliefs. I'm wondering whether that's something akin to rumor mongering, where you hear something, you go, I don't know whether this is true or not. So you pass it on by going, I've heard. And then you check to see whether people agree with you or disagree with you. So if they agree with you, then there might be something to the particular claim, so you continue to track it down. If people disagree with you, then in theory, you kind of stop the inquiry at that point. So what would be interesting in this case would be, what is the reaction to the reposter, depending on the feedback they get on those reposts. And I think about this when I think about the way that Elon Musk uses X. And that Musk doesn't do what Trump does, which simply repost things. Musk does the repost with the word interesting, which is a really, I'm going to say it here, interesting hedge. And that he might be saying interesting because it's true, or interesting because we should find out whether this is true. And it's fairly clear from what we know of Musk's character what he intends by that. But his hedging allows it to look like he's just trying to assess the truth of a particular rumor.
Okay, thanks. That's very nice suggestion. And yeah, I was thinking there's an interesting paper by Altai and some other researcher who were looking at what motivates people to share fake news, and the standard sort of explanation that recurs in people who shared news that turned out to be false is that it would be interesting if true. So that's maybe what Musk wants to suggest. So that this information is relevant because if it turns out to be true, then we should all know about it. But obviously, if it's totally implausible that it would be true, maybe you shouldn't share it. So I would say this is an interesting suggestion, but perhaps in order to explain our results, we should see something going on here as well, right? Because in the unjustified false belief, if we're just reposting in order to start an inquiry into whether or not the content is true or has some foundation to it, then it should not pattern with say making an unjustified false assertion. Whereas we see here that people see no difference. So this is why the results are a bit puzzling. You know, there might be also outcome bias involved in the results, but then why don't we see outcome bias in the other condition? It's a bit odd. So it kind of goes in the direction of explaining, but I think we're still left with some puzzle open here. But thank you.
Greetings in line and behind is getting a touch short.
Great talk, Neri. I think that your experiment is, to my mind at least, is provide good evidence to the idea of retweeting or reposting as plausible deniability. So it gives the people who retweet the possibility to take less responsibilities for what they are doing. But I was wondering whether with this thesis, so to speak, you are also implying the idea that people who are reposting are actually acting in a strategically rational way. Is that what you are implicating? Because that, it seems to me, more controversial. It's not necessary that you have this implication, but in that case, I think you should at least make a note, something to say that you are not committed to say that reposting is a strategic act of rational.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's a nice point. And I guess what I want to say here is that although these people are not strategically communicating or strategically picking, reposting, etc., the very fact that there's an architecture of incentive out there that is built in a certain way sort of indirectly motivate us to act in certain ways. So it becomes more natural to us. It's like, oh, will I post or not repost? If it doesn't matter that much, if I'm not running a big risk, of damaging my reputation, then I'll just repost it because, it's just a repost. So it's not like I'm a strategic speaker, like the guy who's trying to bribe the officer and is trying to find out, this convoluted way of getting things just right so that they can then retract what they're saying. But the fact that, the payoffs are laid out in a certain way will play, maybe subconsciously, and on the long run, also we're talking about the sort of how society behaves as a whole. So yeah, when you change the payoffs in place, I think you indirectly affect behavior in subtle way. I'm not obviously trying to suggest that this is a conscious Machiavellian choice that every single communicator is doing. I hope that goes on in the way, it goes in the way of clarifying the issue, but we should definitely mention it a little bit in the paper to clarify where we're heading there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really interesting. I wanted to ask a bit more about the risk-reward trade-offs and how much you think they're conventional versus kind of rationalistically deterministic. So I was trying to think, is it really conceptually possible to have a speech act where there's low reputational cost when you get it wrong, but you get a high reputational payoff when you get it right? And I was thinking maybe that's not really possible in equilibrium because, well, look, why do you get a reward when you get it right? It's because you staked something. And so if there was no cost to you, if there was no risk in saying it in the first place, then you didn't have a costly signal in the first place. You didn't really give anybody strong evidence that you believed it. And so that'd be one thing. In one model, the reputational reward you get is from they're really rewarding what you believe. And then when you say something that has a potential cost, that's proving that you believe it, and so then you get the reward, and in that kind of model, it just wouldn't be possible to have a speech act that gave you low cost when you fail, but gives you high reward when you succeed. But that's not the only model, so I was just curious what you think about it.
I totally agree with you in terms of that's precisely what motivated us to run that study. We were just like, it can't be like this. That's what, any game theoretic approach to this problem would predict. So let's see if we see these patterns, and those are the patterns that we found. So I agree that was the intuition that motivated the study. Then having said that, is it possible? I don't know, because you have all sort of weird stuff that comes out in the game theoretic literature. Universal deception can be in equilibrium. Okay, I wouldn't have guessed that. So I want to be careful there and say, maybe it is possible to have such an equilibrium, but intuitively, that's the most natural way to think what would happen with a speech that behave in this way would be exact. So I agree with you in every respect, I would say.
Let someone else.
There's no. It
Ask
was
the question the last. Okay, I'll ask a quick question. Thank you so much. I really like the experiments. I have two questions about, but we'll talk about that later. I like the conclusions that you draw, but I was wondering about one thing. Your study is mainly focused on the benefits, the payoffs, and costs, but it doesn't consider why people repost. So I was wondering, you know, if I have different motives for reposting, will I mind about the payoffs and costs? What your study to me suggests is that people, for example, follow the maximum rule in decision. So the maximum rule is if they're posting for the sake of benefits. Because my impression was that your hypothesis was that benefits are really important and costs are important in deciding whether to post or repost. And that people pay attention to whether they're going to suffer reputational harm or not. If this is true, then they're following the maximum rule, which is, you know, choose the best of all worst possible outcomes. And in that sense, it might be rational to repost rather than post. But I was wondering, is this hypothesis correct? Are people really, so I don't have Facebook, or I have Facebook, but I never repost. I don't have Twitter, and to forward stuff, I don't do stuff like that. But when I share something on Facebook, I'm actually not thinking about these costs. I'm thinking about other things, but that could just be me.
yeah. No, I think your question goes in the same.
Yes, exactly.
And I agree. I agree insofar as I think that this is a part of the story. So I don't want to say that it's completely irrelevant that these costs are there and these payoffs are there. But I want to agree that these are not the only costs and benefits, or these are not the only motivations that affect whether or not people decide to repost. There are obviously very important other drivers for communicative behavior, such as expressing group affiliation or emotional motivations. And we know that these are extremely important, especially on social media. So the idea here is that we are sort of studying, you know, it's a complex painting with many colors. We are painting everything with one color. We're looking at the epistemic dimension, but the suggestion is not that the epistemic dimension is the only driver of behavior. We're just trying to look at how the epistemic dimension affects behavior, and then one can build into the picture more dimensions, more drivers, more motivations. We do assume, though, that it will at least partially affect behavior. So it will be one of the factors that contribute to people's behavior online.
You almost gave me a heart attack with La Masia news. I was like, no, is it possible that La Masia is posing?
So we started 2 minutes late, so we have time for one very quick question. Each quick response.
And I think this is, I totally agree that this is one of the important factors affecting reposting behavior. Here's another factor that might be especially relevant for this behavior, and that is people sometimes will post because they want to, as you said, bring others' attention to a specific point, right? And in that case, reposting from an authoritative source might enhance the might be particularly relevant for bringing people's attention, right? If I cite a study from NIH saying that smoking causes cancer, that would be much more effective than saying, but then just making a claim by myself.
Yeah, that sounds right. I don't have anything to object to that, but thanks.
Okay, so round of applause, please.